Hello, class. Many builders have a hard time building good teams around defensive Pokemon, and I can see why. Defensive Pokemon are often called supporting Pokemon because they're often there largely to support the more offensive Pokemon on the team. It's fairly intuitive to start a team with a Breaker or Sweeper and then consider what support it needs. It's often much more difficult to start with support and then find out what offensive Pokemon wants that support. It feels like putting the cart before the horse. Let's look at a quick example from the overused tier to understand where this difficulty comes from. Suppose you're building a team around a Choice Specs Raging Bolt. This is a fantastic breaker, but it has a major weakness. Both of its stabs have immunities, making it very prediction reliant and very vulnerable to being revenge killed. You'll end up in a lot of scenarios where you're locked into a move that your opponent is immune to, and you'll have to switch out. So, to support Choice Specs Raging Bolt, you really want to make sure that you have solid switch-ins to the Fairy and Ground types that will block and threaten to KO Raging Bolt. Corviknight is a solid partner as it's good against Fairy and Ground types. This makes sense for many players. It's not too difficult to follow. It's much more difficult to start your team with a Corviknight and ask yourself, what offensive Pokemon or Breaker appreciates the defensive properties of my Corviknight? It's a hard question to answer, and it feels like working backwards. Instead of trying to answer this difficult question, many builders instead default to defensive support for that defensive Pokemon. They'll start a team with Corviknight and realize that something like Ting-Lu can help with Corviknight's weakness to electric and provide a special wall. And this isn't a bad core, but it's not a good way to build. If you continue building this way, what happens next? Maybe you notice you need a water and fire resist and add on a Primarina. But then you realize you're looking pretty weak to Ogerpon Wellspring, so you add on a Pecharunt. And by the time you have 6 Pokemon, you realize that your team has no real way of making progress. You've basically accidentally just built a stall team, and probably not a very good stall team if it wasn't your intention. Now, if building stall is your goal, then yes, you should have 6 walls, but oftentimes builders want to end up with a balance or even an offense team, but end up with a team way bulkier than intended. The right way to build is by starting with a breaking core, or more accurately, a progress-making core, a group of Pokemon that can dismantle your opponent's defensive core. This is basically the engine of your team, how it actually gets wins. In other words, when starting a team, you want to think offensively right off the bat. Don't look at the defensive weaknesses of your starting Pokemon. There will be time to fix your team's type chart matchup later. Instead, focus on how your team is going to make progress. If you start your team with defensive cores supporting more defensive cores, it's very difficult to make a team that can effectively make progress. This is a big reason why it's way easier to start your team with an offensive Pokemon. If the first thing you add is a breaker, like Hisuian Arcanine or Hoopa Unbound, your breaking core or progress-making core is already well underway. In every team building guide I've ever made, I start with an offensive Pokemon because it's a lot easier to work with and a lot more intuitive for viewers. But what if you want to build around a defensive Pokemon, like Clodsire? Well, what you want to do is immediately shift your focus to the offensive progress-making aspect of your team. So you have to ask that difficult question. What progress-making Pokemon appreciates the defensive properties of Clodsire? That's the point of this video, to help you answer that question. How to find good progress-making partners if you start your build with a defensive Pokemon. The best way to learn this is to look at examples. Let's start with defensive pivots, which are just defensive Pokemon that have switching moves. These are the easiest type of defensive Pokemon to work into your progress-making core. The purpose of defensive pivots is primarily to help breakers or frail offensive Pokemon enter the field. So if you start your team with a defensive pivot, something like Galarian Slowking, Pecharunt, Corviknight, Alomomola, the first thing you want to do is assemble a list of what that Pokemon is typically using their pivot move against. This will guide you to what offensive Pokemon is a good idea to pair with it. For example, let's look at Galarian Slowking. What is it typically going to be using Chilly Reception on? If I look throughout the tier, I'd say Garganacl, Gholdengo, Gliscor, Heatran, Iron Crown, Iron Treads, Kingambit, Ting-Lu, Tyranitar, and other Galarian Slowking are some of the most common Pokemon people switch into Galarian Slowking. So what breaker is good at hitting these Pokemon hard? Well, nothing is amazing against all of them, but Ogerpon Wellspring and Primarina are very strong against most. Both of these are good options. So if you start your team with a Galarian Slowking, don't think, oh well, it's weak to Ghost, Dark, and Ground, maybe I should add a Mandibuzz. No. Think about what powerful Pokemon it can help enter the field. Also, note that Primarina and Ogerpon Wellspring are just two examples of breakers that fit well with Galarian Slowking. There are many more. There is no exact right answer to the question of what Pokemon should be paired with what, but there are ways to think about building that are more and less likely to lead to a good team. Moving on, what if the defensive Pokemon isn't a pivot? Well, if it's a hazard setter, that's another one that's not too difficult to work with, particularly if it's a strong hazard setter that can set Stealth Rock or Spikes on common removal Pokemon and keep those hazards up. Garganacl is a great example of a strong hazard setter in Overused. Great Tusk, Iron Treads, Hatterene, and Corviknight all hate taking Salt Cure. If a Garganacl wants Stealth Rock to go up, it can get it, and it can keep those Stealth Rocks up. So if you start your build with Garganacl, you can look for a breaker that really appreciates Stealth Rock being up. Now, of course, all breakers enjoy hazards being up, but some rely on it more than most. Rillaboom, for example, absolutely needs hazards to wear down threats like Corviknight, Zapdos, and Moltres. It really has no shot of getting past these threats otherwise, so it loves being paired with Pokemon like Garganacl or Heatran that are good at setting up Stealth Rock and keeping them on the field. Another archetype of defensive Pokemon is hazard removal. Especially defensive Rapid Spin Iron Treads, Defog Corviknight, defensive Rapid Spin Great Tusk, and Defog Galarian Weezing are the main ones in Overused. You could also include defensive Hatterene sets, not technically removal, but it does help a lot with hazards. Galarian Weezing, though, in particular, is excellent at removing hazards since it uses Defog with neutralizing gas, bypassing Gholdengo's good as gold. Despite not being a pivot or setting hazards to support offensive Pokemon, Weezing works really well when paired with threats that appreciate hazards being off the field. So Kyurem, Ogerpon Wellspring, Choice Specs Iron Moth, and other threats that are really weak to hazards really like being paired with Weezing. Alright, but what if you're building around a defensive Pokemon that isn't a pivot hazard setter or has had any form of hazard removal? Take, for example, a physically defensive Rocky Helmet Hydrapple. That doesn't fill any of these roles. Well, what you can do is make a list of the things that a bulky Hydrapple is great at switching into. I'd say Garganacl, Landorus, Ogerpon, Ogerpon Wellspring, Rillaboom, Hisuian Samurott, Tinglu, Tyranitar, and Zamazenta are the ones that jump out at me, and Kingambit as well if you're using Body Press. So now that we've got this list, we want to ask, are there any offensive Pokemon that really appreciate that Hydrapple is an easy switch to these? Are these Pokemon regularly entering on any major breakers? One that jumps out at me is Metal Coat Gholdengo. It's a really strong stall breaker, but it usually needs to enter the field a few times to KO threats like Hisuian Samurott, Tinglu, and Kingambit. Hydrapple can chip Samurott and Kingambit with the Rocky Helmet, and give Gholdengo a safe switch out in a lot of these cases where it's vulnerable after a special attack drop from Make It Rain. Also, this strategy of looking at what a certain wall can switch into and observing which offensive threats appreciate having that switch out support can be used on Pokemon that are pivots, hazard setters, and removal as well. The more ways you can find synergy, the better. These categories I went over are examples, but there are many other types of defensive Pokemon that synergize well with certain offensive Pokemon for various reasons. Alomomola, Umbreon, and Screamtail have Wish and can pass health to teammates, so a Pokemon that takes a lot of damage, like a Flare Blitz Blaziken or a Flame Orb Ursaluna, appreciates the support. Weather setters like Pelipper and Torkoal are best paired with Pokemon that take advantage of the weather, of course, either through just being water or fire types or through abilities. Galarian Slowking works well with Kyurem thanks to the defense boost Snow grants to Ice types, and the 100% accurate Blizzard Kyurem can use. There are a ton of reasons a defensive Pokemon could work well with an offensive one. Hopefully this video has shown you some of those ways through examples. The big lesson of the video is this: if you start building a team with a defensive Pokemon, don't keep adding more defensive Pokemon unless you're trying to build stall. As quickly as possible in the team building process, right after you add that first defensive Pokemon or defensive core, whatever you're building around, immediately think about what progress-making core that defensive Pokemon or defensive core does a good job of supporting. That's going to help you build better teams that get things done, and you won't keep accidentally making teams that are too bulky and too passive. If you learned something from this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. If you have any questions or you want my advice on building around a particular defensive Pokemon, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll do my best to respond to them all. I also want to acknowledge that I didn't go over the full team building process in this video. I wanted to specifically focus on the struggle of starting a team with a defensive Pokemon, since many people have asked me about this. If I were to discuss the rest of the building process, adding further support, adding basic team requirements, balancing out the team's type chart and such, I felt that would bloat this video and dilute the key message. But if you want to see that full building process, I have a video called The 8 Steps to Team Build in Competitive Pokemon, where I go over all of that, which will be linked in the description. Also, I tried making use of the blur effect in this video. I try to use background replays to keep people engaged, but when discussing specific examples, I find it may be a little overstimulating. I considered just cutting to the team builder for this section, but I found that many find that too unengaging. Let me know what you think. Was the blurring a good balance? Was it annoying and you just want to see the game clearly? Or would you prefer I go into the team builder for those explanation portions? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Well, that's all. Class dismissed.